We'll give it a minute or so and then we'll get started. Right, I think we're just about on time, so let's get started. Good morning to everybody. My name is Sean Hartman. I head up Risk and Compliance at Generation E. Welcome to the webinar on securing data in an AI world. Just for attendee purposes, the session is being recorded and the recording will be accessible to all attendees after the session. Just be aware that any chat comments, questions, etc. are going to be captured. So if you do have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A. We'll try and get to those at the end. Anything that we can't answer or don't have time to get to, we'll put all those answers together for you. We'll package them up and send them out to everyone who attends the call. So just very briefly about myself. As head of risk and compliance at Generation E, I'm responsible ultimately to work with customers around the preparation for Copilot and that journey into AI. Now, the same things that customers are telling us they have some concerns about are the same things that I have concerns about at Generation E. And so it puts me in a little bit of a unique position being responsible for how we deal with Copilot and AI within our own business, and then also how we work with customers on preparing and getting ready for AI in their own organizations. So just in terms of what we're going to be covering today, we're basically looking at two parts to today's session. The first part is really what we are seeing with customers. What are the things that are keeping them awake at night, and what are they concerned about? What are they worried about? And why is it actually a problem for some of them? And then the second part of the presentation is really looking at where does Microsoft provide solutions to help us get ready for AI? And then what do we do about it, right? How do we actually get started? We do have lots of customers who are just about ready to pull the trigger, but not really sure where to start. All right, so we'll try and provide some helpful scenarios and use cases for where you begin. So we all know that generative AI is here. I mean, if we consider how quickly ChatGPT took to get to 100 million users, it is probably the fastest technology and the most disruptive we've ever seen. Realistically, though, it also comes with some associated risks. Now, a lot of the customers that we work with, probably the biggest thing we hear is data, right? The risk of data leakage is probably the biggest concern for a lot of organizations that we work with. It certainly was one of the biggest concerns we had at Generation E when we embarked on this journey ourselves a few years ago when Copilot first launched. The other thing is some of those considerations and risks we need to think about is, you know, according to trend indexes and all of the reporting that seems to be going on all over the place at the moment. Shadow AI, 75% of employees admit to bringing their own AI to work. I can tell you that even at Generation E, we certainly saw that in the early days. We had everything from Gemini and AI inside of all sorts of applications showing up everywhere as people started playing with this stuff. And it's important for us to be able to at least get a lens on these things to determine what's going on inside of these workspaces. The other problem is new vulnerabilities and threats. I do recall in the very early days of Copilot where an initial flaw was found where we could almost do prompt injection by putting white text into an email, and when that came up, it was driving some behaviors and sending data outside the organization that really shouldn't have been going out. Now, those have all been fixed long ago, and those were found really quickly. But new vulnerabilities and threats, I think they're going to be threats that we haven't even perceived or thought about or can even envision. If we think about some of the newer technologies, even fake AI, incorrect data being presented, it's very difficult to know what these threats and landscapes are going to look like. And then the other thing is really around non-compliance, right? So the EU certainly has the AI Act over there that requires very strict reporting on how AI is being used. We're also starting to see a lot of organizations request that if any data has been created with AI, that we need to be open and transparent about the fact that we are using AI to create that data. Now, that may be for internal compliance controls, but we also need to be aware and keep an eye on what new controls and compliance is going to be out there, what regulatory compliances are going to be available to us in the next X amount of time. So just from a Microsoft perspective, now, Microsoft has commitments and controls, certainly around Copilot. So the mantra from Microsoft, obviously, is that Copilot is built on trust. Now, data being secured at rest and in transit, and your data is not being used to actually train Copilot. So for people who are concerned that Copilot is being trained on your data, that's not quite accurate. Also, Microsoft does provide inherent built-in controls for Copilot. So think about controls where people are trying to coax Copilot into giving information that is questionable, right? So perhaps something like, hey, Copilot, I've got a bunch of materials at home that look a particular way. What would happen if I mix certain materials together? Trying to work out how to do something that would be considered potentially dangerous. We have protections in place for Copilot to recognize and start looking at some of that data, and we also have tools to be able to report on that type of behavior as well. And then Microsoft does have a copyright commitment as well, which is published on their website if anybody really wants to go and have a look at that. We do, however, acknowledge that whilst Microsoft does provide some controls, there is a shared responsibility. And whilst Microsoft will look after things like privacy and compliance and keeping prompts, responses, etc., within the service boundary and keeping it within your tenant so that we're not getting data leakage between tenants, we do have to recognize that things like access to AI apps, right? People bringing their own AI to work, the way we protect and govern data, user accountability, how do we train them? How to ensure that they understand what they can and can't do with AI tools, how they should be using those tools responsibly, even what they do with the data that is established or created from AI. That's all our own responsibilities, right? We have to be able to set up the guardrails for ourselves to be able to manage that. That's what we call that shared responsibility model. Microsoft will protect some of it. We've got to do the rest. Now, in reality, what we see with a lot of customers today is we get this, we're not ready for Copilot because the data's a mess. And when we ask questions about, well, why do you think the data's a mess, or how have you proved this? How do you know that there's a problem? More often than not, we get we just know. But the reality is Copilot's already everywhere, right? We're seeing it on desktops and it doesn't always even have to be Copilot. We've got people starting to play with even hybrid AI systems that are being built at home, and yeah, it's quite incredible what's going on there. The reality is, though, AI is changing the risk profile, and then ultimately what we need to be able to do is find the balance, right? Data that was typically obscured just because it was buried in locations, unfortunately, is now findable. What used to be private or pseudo-private is now reusable. So think about people's OneDrives where we might have shared something in a chat session at some point. We've moved away. Some of that data access lingers long after the fact, even long beyond when that chat experience is finished or closed off and we're no longer talking about a particular topic. And what used to be slow, so manual digging around for information, particularly in SharePoint libraries, especially where metadata is not being used extensively, sometimes it took a long time to find things. And you really needed to know what you were searching for, which versions, where did it live, who ultimately was the creator or responsible owner of this data. That used to tend to be quite slow and cumbersome. The reality is this is now instantaneous, right? Regardless of what the state of our data estates is, AI ultimately is an amplifier, right? So gaps in data management become exposures, controls become leverage, right? So for organizations that have permission sprawl, a lot of sensitive content sitting all over the place, with generative AI and particularly with Copilot, some of that data is being exposed pretty quickly. Now, for a lot of the companies and organizations that we work with, trying to understand what that risk is or what the fear factor is pretty important, because we do have a lot of organizations that believe that they're storing a lot of data that is highly sensitive, and when we really look under the covers and lift the skirts and have a little peek around, we find that that's not always the case. In some cases, that may well be accurate. For us, we do find other challenges that we typically find with organizations in this space, and we'll cover some of those as we go through this. The other thing that we do need to do is at least acknowledge that there is a critical transition taking place. Now, whilst this session is not specifically focused on agentic AI, and is more concerned about the data estate and where do we start, we do have to acknowledge that there is rapid transformation taking place here, and we've already got customers deploying agents all over the place, even before any governance has been put in place. And in reality, with Copilot chat, those early days of AI, ask a question, get a response. It's still up to me to use the information that I'm given with discretion. Where with AI agents, there is no discretionary. AI agents just don't possess fear, right? They actually act. They do things. They perform actions. They delete things. They click things. They write things. They they build things. So whilst not specifically focused around agentic AI, we just do need to, at the very least, accept that the space is evolving rapidly. So what we call the hesitation cycle is something that we often see with customers who start this Copilot journey. So it's particularly in the early days, and I know there's been quite a lot of information dispersed in social media. So, there was a lot of hype around the early AI and ChatGPT, and how great is this? How wonderful is this? We've got to get it into our businesses. We've got to get it going. But ultimately, some of this did lead to a few surprises. And I think some organizations were a little bit shocked at what data actually gets exposed, because on the surface, it didn't appear that there was a point of exposure. We think we've got a handle on a bunch of things, and then all of a sudden we find certain types of data that really shouldn't have been there leaking out. Even at Generation E, in those early days, we kind of ran a few little internal red teaming exercises to see if we could go and find some of this data that we were concerned about. And we certainly found it, and we also found out why certain things were happening. That required some behavioral changes inside the organization. So for a lot of customers who then, at that point of surprise, either pause or ultimately just slow this whole thing down. So all that initial ramp up of AI, we have seen in some instances just slow down a little bit. Particularly as we then start looking at what governance do we need to put in place to prevent number two, that surprise factor. Really, where we begin when we think about where do we actually start? I guess from a Generation E perspective, we started with deployment straight up front, right? Enable Copilot for as many people as we could get our hands on. Start creating content. Let's build things. Let's do things. Let's ask questions. Let's learn. Let's get cracking. A lot of the organizations that we work with specifically do not even have governance policies in place. And it's quite common. What some companies will tell us is we really don't need any of these policies because we've got acceptable usage policies. When we onboard new staff, they already know that there's a responsibility. But I think in many cases, we've got to think beyond just, is this an acceptable usage policy? Some of the things that we're going to have to start thinking about, which ultimately is potentially risky behaviors in the organization, is what happens with data we create with AI if it is proven to be incorrect. So we've seen some reports where organizations have been paid large sums of money to produce reports and incredible data, and then it turns out that citations, actual court cases that were referenced, don't exist. So we're sitting in this position where who then is responsible, who's accountable, and what are we going to do about it when that happens? Do we need a human in the loop? Do we need an AI agent in the loop to confirm and validate? Do we need a team of researchers out there ensuring that some of the stuff we're creating is in fact true and accurate? So even at that pre-deployment phase, we've got to be thinking about some of these things, right? And then, of course, what are the compliance and legal issues if these things occur? I've seen reports where organizations are having to pay back some of these huge sums of money because of data that actually wasn't there. What we talk about when we work with customers, particularly in those early phases, is we think about AI-ready governance as being 4 foundational pillars. So the first pillar being know, right? And that's know your data. What is the data that we're ultimately needing to protect, or how sensitive is it? How usable is it? And in many cases, even how old is it, right? Copilot doesn't typically distinguish between documents that were created yesterday and documents that might be there from 10 years ago, right? We're using all of that knowledge together. And in some cases, data that is sitting in SharePoint libraries for a long time, probably not very useful for what users need to be able to do with that data. The second pillar is then protect, right? How do we protect this data? In most cases, we create a lot of data that is unlabeled. I work with organizations all the time where there are no labeling schemas, so we are not even allowing users to determine the classification of that data. And in many cases where there are labels available to classify data, users haven't actually been trained or understand what constitutes PI data, as an example. So understanding the data and then being able to protect it is really important. The third thing then would be the prevention, right? So how do we then prevent that sensitive data from leaking outside the organization? What do we do with that data? How do we report on it, and how do we watch for it? Those are typically the 4 foundations. We could probably add govern your data as a 5th pillar, whilst not 100% related to AI. When we talk about governing data, we typically talk about retention, disposal of data, records management as an example. Most companies that we work with, and even ourselves, we've been guilty of this on occasion, is we hoard data too long, right? Data that is just not necessary to be held on to. We keep that data way too long. But there are other considerations beyond just holding it in SharePoint where it's available for things like Copilot. Right? So just in terms of the biggest challenge we typically see with organizations and data leakage is typically oversharing. Now, when we think about oversharing, certainly in my experience, a lot of organizations, just default configurations that are in SharePoint are just not good enough, right? So the default sharing links in SharePoint might be, everyone in the organization. And what has happened in the past, as an example, is I may go into a SharePoint location that is locked down for a handful of users. I then hit the copy link button. I might post that in an email. I might send it in a chat message. So we paste that copy link, and the default config on that is to allow everyone in the organization to access it. Now, prior to Copilot, what used to happen was that data was not actually accessible to your user community until such time as the link was claimed. So what we mean by that is, unless that email was forwarded to somebody it shouldn't have been forwarded to, or somebody was being added to a Teams channel or chat message where that link is sitting, that data wasn't accessible until somebody actually clicked on the link. Copilot, unfortunately, doesn't behave that way. Copilot doesn't consider user behavior in this particular instance. The fact is that link exists. It's currently available. It's currently open to The default sharing might be everyone in the organization. Well, Copilot can use that data, right? It's not concerned whether a user has actually clicked on a file or opened a file or opened a link. It's only concerned with, do you have permissions? Yes, I will use that data. So that's typically where we see probably the biggest issue in the blast radius as far as Copilot goes. Some of the other things like broad Teams memberships, Teams being created as public, even though we only add a few individuals to those teams. Generally, because they're not configured as private, they're configured as open. It does mean anybody can get access there, because that's the nature of the site, which then obviously feeds into those open SharePoint sites. The other thing is files dropped in chats. So chat messages that may start up with 2 or 3 individuals. We have a conversation. I drop a file into the chat. It copies it to my OneDrive, depending on where that data has come from. Maybe it's a document I started on my desktop. I've dumped it in there. It goes into OneDrive. Ultimately, what happens though is we may kill that chat off over time, but as an individual who's copied that file and it's available in OneDrive, I'm certainly not spending a lot of time going in to remove permissions specifically for that file, because it's just not the way we think. The reality is that file has still been shared, it's open, it's available, which means Copilot's probably going to be able to use it. So these are the things that we typically see as being the blast radius, right? So whilst it might look like we've got some control over permissions or management in SharePoint sites, etc., typically the default sharing links is what's causing the greatest issue. So how do we contain oversharing? Microsoft has a bunch of controls available to us. The ability for us to go and surface the links that are available. SharePoint Advanced Management, if you've got a single Copilot license, bless Microsoft for allowing us access to SharePoint Advanced Management with just one Copilot license. It is a really useful set of tools that are available in there. Gives us some great control and some ability to do some really good reporting, so that we can go and find these things and fix them up. The other thing is access reviews, permission inheritance as an example. We see that all the time. Broken permission inheritance in SharePoint is a real problem. One of the ways we can solve that is with a toggle switch in SharePoint called restricted access groups, which ultimately allows us to manage security at a group layer. If you're not a member of the group, even if you were added individually to a site, that access would automatically be revoked. We typically recommend using that sparingly, because if you do that all over the place, you could create some unintended consequences. But there are ways that we can deal with this. The other thing is sensitive information being shared. So we can prevent some of that with data loss prevention. Inactive workspaces tends to be enormous. Generation E had many of those in the old days as well. So we've had to really go through an effort to go and have a look at the data that we had. It's inactive. When last was it accessed? Why is it not being used? Do we still need it? What do we do with it? Do we have a compliance obligation to keep it? Where do we store it if we don't want to keep it on SharePoint? Because we all know SharePoint storage is pretty expensive. So Microsoft has answers for everything, right? So when we look at that data security stack from Microsoft, they have the ability, they've got the tools for us to discover content. So Content Explorer, data classification, dashboards, data security posture management. There's sensitive information types. I say some of those are a little bit hit and miss, unfortunately. It's just the way that some of that data is created and crafted. But there is a lot of information there, right? On the classification side, we have the ability to create labels. We have the ability to protect that content using encryption techniques. We've got usage rights that we can assign to different content. We, in some regulated industries, bring your own key. So other techniques for the protection of that data. Then on the prevention side, we typically look at DLP. Right, so data loss prevention across Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, even endpoints, right? So those managed endpoints, do we want people to be able to copy sensitive data to USB drives? Do we want them to be able to paste data into browsers? All of that kind of stuff can be managed and used with DLP. We can also now assign data loss prevention policies to Copilot as well, so that we can determine what data Copilot should not have access to, even if the user has permission. So there are a few things that we can do around that. And then govern data, right? So retention, disposition, data lifecycle management, all available within that single stack as well. And then around detection, so we obviously have alerting, which would typically be our audit logs, and what do we do with those logs? Where do we send the data? Do we integrate that with a SOC, a SIEM, other technologies? But from a Microsoft perspective, insider risk management, communication compliance, pretty key inside of that stack as well. So insider risk management, typically associated with measuring the change in behaviors rather than actual behavior. So, I myself, as an example, if my typical usage is I'll download, I'll work and download 10 documents a day. If that all of a sudden becomes 2,000, well, there's a high risk that something has changed. Is it because I'm preparing to leave the organization and I'm trying to exfiltrate data, or is there something else going on, right? Has my identity been compromised in some way? So that's what insider risk management's there for. And then communication compliance, prior to AI, was more about looking at internal communications, so workplace harassment, bullying, that kind of thing. These days, we're starting to see a lot of communication compliance policies be deployed specifically for AI to ensure that we know that if somebody's trying to use AI in a manner that we're not. We don't want them to use it, right? So we don't want them to try and circumvent good AI practices by asking Copilot to pretend that the gift that I'm going to be giving somebody doesn't come off as a gift, as an example, right? So asking AI how you would do that in an unethical way, we probably want to be knowing about some of these things. So really, the cornerstone of where we typically start these exercises with organizations is around sensitivity labels. So for getting permissions at the moment, right? Permissions are absolutely critical. But if we are working with highly sensitive data, we really need to be tagging that data in some way, right? So what those labels look like is going to be very different for different organizations. Government typically has predefined label schemas that they need to work within to keep things consistent across all government agencies. But, different organizations are going to have different needs. And what we do with those labels is ultimately where things become important for us, right? So really critical data, we would typically want that data encrypted. So, might be confidential PI data, it might be highly confidential SLT data. That data needs to be encrypted, because even if there was a copy link that was sent, or it cannot change the underlying encryption on the document. If the data was accidentally misplaced, or obfuscated in some way, the access still requires identity to be able to access it. So, we need that encryption capability. Microsoft are really good at auto application of labels at scale. Now, generally, we tend to be a little bit more cautious around what it is that we're applying auto application against. So things like passport numbers, tax file numbers, those are pretty unique numbers for our region, ANZ. So those tend to be a very good hit rate on picking things up, but medical, there'd be things like medical conditions which are typically really broad-based, and we don't necessarily want to be encrypting and protecting content when somebody has put a letter in saying, hey, I've got a headache today, I'm not going to make a meeting, right? That's not useful. So when we think about auto application, in many cases, we have the ability to train data on what it is that we want to protect. And how we do that then is a little bit of a journey, right? But also it's good because it does provide us with some visible cues as well, right? So when we apply a label to a document, we could put in a header, footer, a watermark. It keeps sensitivity visible all over the place. And if we do use encryption on documents, we also then have the ability to do dynamic watermarking. So when somebody opens a document that is of a particular sensitivity, we can dynamically watermark that document for that period of time. And the reason we might do that is, in some regulated industries, hospitals potentially is where a nurse might have a patient form open. They might want to do a dynamic watermark on there to at least prevent people from taking photos and other things of sensitive data. And then just finally, Copilot honors these labels as well, right? So if I utilize Copilot with data that is already labeled as being confidential, any new data it creates from that confidential data will automatically be labeled as confidential as well. That's really important for us, particularly where we have policies in place to capture that data and protect that data. So this is really where DLP and those labels play together, right? So what we also have the ability to do is put that moment of action guardrail in place, right? So we can notify a user that data may be sensitive for some reason. Are you sure you want to do this? A visual cue. We can give users the ability to justify why they might need to send something, right? So we know that we have industries where we want to block the sharing of credit card information, except for somebody in the finance department, as an example. So we have the ability to allow people to put a justification of why they're overriding our default policies. We capture that, and we can then review those reports in the audit logs for that. We can also block, just prevent sharing entirely. That's typically progressive and making sure that your policies are really clearly and well defined before you put block enablements in. And then the other thing is for DLP, particularly in email, we can't do this at a file level in SharePoint, but certainly for email, where we think there's something that should not be going out via an email, we can actually pseudo hold that message, ultimately sending it to a manager or to somebody else for approval before it gets released. Right. And then visibility, as I mentioned before, Content Explorer, Activity Explorer, Insider Risk Management, all of these are available. We can report on all of them. We can look at this stuff, make sure that we're on top of these things, right? Ultimately, you can't govern what you can't see. So Microsoft provides us with the tools for that. Just how these all kind of tie together. So if we think about a document lifecycle as an example, a user creates a document where we've got order classification in place. You know, that classifier may pop up and say to the user, hey, it looks like there's this type of data. We recommend you label it as confidential or highly confidential, whatever our policies are. A label then is applied depending on its sensitivity. We may do encryption, watermark. At that point in time, we're also auditing because we want to be able to, as soon as a document is labeled, we need to know whenever that label changes, right? Is the label being upgraded because sensitive data has been put in there, or is it being downgraded by somebody? What's the reason for the downgrade? We also then have the ability, if the user then sends that document externally, right? Are we going to block that data from being shared, or are we going to require justification for it to go out? Can that content be used by AI, right? Copilot. Are we going to put a restriction in place that Copilot cannot use it, or are we just going to let Copilot use it but create new content with the same label? We need to be able to monitor that, and then at the end of the day, we also need to be able to manage the life cycle of that document, right? So from cradle to grave, what happens at that point in time when that document is no longer needed? I think the reality is we create an awful lot of content in our daily lives that a lot of that content actually does become stale pretty quickly. We do hold on to it for an awfully long time. So, you know, we need to be able to manage the life cycle of that data in a way that's appropriate, but still meets our regulatory requirements. So just kind of getting towards the end of this is around that data quality and hygiene, right? A lot of organizations that we work with do use retention policies as a backup mechanism. Ultimately, we work with too many organizations where they have a single default policy configured that says retain everything forever. That means we are retaining all the versions. We are retaining all the data. We're just never cleaning it up. We're never getting rid of it. And as a system integrator, look, we love to sell SharePoint storage. We make nice money on that, but that's not ideal, right? Ultimately, the storage that's available in SharePoint should be used appropriately. We need to manage that data. And one of the things that we then do have to consider is if we are going to extract data outside of SharePoint for the purposes of keeping data lean, tidy, useful, what do we do with that data? Where do we store it? What are the regulatory requirements for it, right? If I work with a medical organization, as an example, who may have to keep patient records for 25 years, we probably don't want 25-year-old data inside a SharePoint, but we need to put it somewhere, right? So we have to then be thinking about where do we store it so that legally we can hand it over when it's required, right? Right, so on the licensing side, essentially, there are some capabilities that are included with E3, pretty basic on the Microsoft E3 front. So the ability to do manual labeling. Now, you may notice that I've not included all the new E7 SKU or the new Copilot agent SKUs, right? So agent management SKUs. We're specifically talking about the data management stuff at the moment, right? So I didn't want to cloud muddy the water with all the new E7 stuff. So in terms of E5, everything's included, but there is also an add-on path for E3. Now, there are typically 2 SKUs available. The first one is the compliance suite, which gives us a full bundled compliance solution of Purview. So that'll be everything from insider risk management, all the advanced e-discovery stuff, communication compliance, insider risk management, information barriers, where the IP&G basically stands for Information Protection and Governance Add-on. That add-on suite gives you the ability to do data governance, right? So we can do manual and automatic labeling of data, encryption of data, DLP. We can do some retention disposition stuff, data classification, etc. All right. So not necessarily the insider risk management portions, the advanced e-discovery, communication compliance stuff, but at least the management of the data stack itself. So where do we start, right? For most of the organizations that we work with, we have this 30, 60, 90-day recommendation for customers, right? Start somewhere. At the very least, in that first 30 days, go and run a content and permission scan, go and have a look at your estate, go and have a look at the permissions that are out there, go and generate reports that tell you how many sharing links are out there, how many of them are overblown. If you do have access to the compliance suite, go and run some data security posture management reports that should give you some good insights into what links are out there. Identify what those top oversharing patterns are. So there will be some recommendations in the reports that you can derive from there. Go and define a label taxonomy, right? You don't have to start with encryption on day one, but you can certainly define a taxonomy. We don't recommend that it's overly complex. Don't create 15, 20 labels. That's unnecessary. Keep it simple, keep it small. And then, from 30 to 60 days, go and publish these labels, get people to start manually labeling that content, turn on DLP for well-known information, right? Tax file numbers, custom identifiers potentially, passport numbers, whatever it is that you feel would be useful. Turn it on for the well-known types, not all over the place. Change the default sharing links, right? The number one recommendation we typically tell organizations is change the default link type to be only people with existing access. Now, you cannot see that in the GUI inside of SharePoint on the main default link type, but you can run a PowerShell command that'll switch it to only people with existing access. That way, these sharing links would help out. Also go and set expiry on all sharing links. They don't need to be open and indexed forever. Just set a reasonable expiry limit on them. Go and run some access reviews. If you got access to some of the tools, or even go and run some SharePoint advanced management tools, go and run some access reviews. Go and find out if people still need access to the data. Right, we'd often find that a lot of people come back. So those user groups that have access, they're probably too entitled. Right, we don't need as many people who have access to this data. And in many cases, we might even find data that actually hasn't been used, doesn't need to be there for a long, hasn't been used in a long time. We can get rid of it. And then at the 90-day, and in fact sometimes beyond, we then start saying if you're going to do auto labeling to take some of that away from your user community, auto labeling applies also to retention labels. So, knowing what your data types are, maybe using some trainable classifiers, or the other types of identifiers that are available for us to go and identify that data, capture that data. We might start looking at auto labeling some of that stuff, putting endpoint DLP in place. So getting those devices managed, preferably by Intune, pushing out your purview add-in so that we can block data from being pasted into other AI browsers, etc. Start looking at standing up your insider risk policies. And once you're there, really, there's no further issue with Copilot as far as we can tell, right? Other than, some of the other things we've mentioned in the call today. How do we manage this? How do we allow users to do things, but in a way that's sustainable? And really, from barrier to enabler, right? So instead of governance being a barrier to Copilot, turn it into something that becomes a competitive advantage. It's not particularly advantageous for companies who have stale, old, unmanaged data, but if your data is governed and you can get people using Copilot, it becomes a competitive advantage. And with that, I will have that final slide. So just so that it's up there, if you'd like to talk to us, either go and have a look on our website, send us an email, contact us. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, I think we will pop in and see if there's been any questions in the chat. Just one thing, probably one of the common questions we get is, where do we draw the line between privacy and useful AI? And that's a really difficult question for us to answer because there's no single hard line there. There's obviously tension between how do we maximize value? Because if we maximize value and we throw AI everywhere, we have the risk of data leakage and privacy breaches and brand reputation damage. But if we maximize privacy, we then have the problem where we may lock AI down to a place where it becomes unusable or really low value. So, we do want to say that data needs to be useful and appropriate to surface in context of what's being asked for. And that's not always a 30-second answer, or, we'll check a few we'll tick a few check boxes and it'll just magically happen. There are a few things that we would need to work through to determine what that looks like and how useful does it become. And with that, we're going to see if there are any on the Q&A. Troy, do you have any advice on having arguments with AI? It's an interesting question, but not particularly useful, unfortunately. And there are multiple reasons for that, right? So Sam Altman is famous for saying, please stop saying, please, thank you, etc. to AI because it's costing millions. It's costing them absolute fortunes in compute power. Having an argument with AI, unfortunately, is not particularly useful, right? We need to have a methodology whereby we have a human in the loop to verify what we're being given advice on. It's unfortunately, AI is there to be helpful. It doesn't give false information just for the sake of giving false information. It is trying to be helpful, and unfortunately that sometimes means we do have a few challenges with what it's giving us. The license tiers are required for the security features. I think we covered that in the slide. And then the last question there is on the topic of files and data. How can these conversations be purged? That's a great question, Troy. There's we obviously have retention disposition schedules. What we are finding as well is we do have several third-party solutions now, much in the way that Microsoft partners with third parties for compliance recording around voice. We can actually now do that across several other channels as well, including Copilot communications. However, from a purging perspective, we need to be able to prove disposition. We can certainly do that with standard policies and that, right? At the end of the day, those conversations are actually living inside of Exchange, so we need to create the right policies to ensure that those messages are being purged appropriately. And with that,
there's also just
John
Kenny's got his hand up, so he should be able to unmute himself.
Yeah, sure. John Kenny. Let's just.
No, that's okay, guys. I just posted it, but I replied to an existing comment, so I've just put it in there again.
I don't see it. No.
Okay.
I'm not sure where it went. Hang on. Oh, as a comment. Sorry.
I can talk to you about it. So we've got Netscope, and we're planning on. It's at the start of the journey for us, so we haven't done any labeling or anything like that yet. But we don't want to increase our E3 licensing, so we're planning on increasing or adding the purview licenses that allows us to auto label and manage the sensitivity labels within E3. But then use the third-party Netscope for the actual monitoring of the DLP going outside and the business. So, do you guys have experience, or are you purely a Microsoft house when it comes to DLP?
When it comes to DLP, we've worked with a few solutions. So even though we're a Microsoft SI, John, it's not my intent or our intent to say you have to do something this way. Yeah. We work with the Microsoft solutions all the time. Just on the comment you made about auto labeling with E3, you do still need an uplift license to auto label, right?
Yeah,
so the information protection governance as a minimum. Yeah. Once you have that, where you do your blocking, holding, reviewing, we don't have a you must do it this way. That's not useful for anybody, right? There are many solutions out there. There's a reason these solutions exist. They all have a space, and you may actually get big bang for your buck by integrating because you use it for other technologies or other solutions. So it's not our job to say Microsoft is the only solution, right? The intent is we want to protect the data. We want as many people using AI as possible. We want you to use it ethically. How you block.
So that purview license that we need to include on top of our E3 licensing, does that provide the blocking and the holding for review as well, or is that just literally going to allow us to manage the sensitivity labels?
So no, it includes DLP. It includes. Let me just give me 1 sec here. So I do have.
Because I mean, basically, I don't really want to pay double. So if I have to pay for the purview licensing for auto labeling, plus I'm getting the DLP included, I may as well continue down the Microsoft path.
Yeah, so bear in mind, we get basic DLP with a standard E3 license. Now, what that means is I can do standard blocking of files and email. if I want to do blocking inside of chat, I then need to upgrade to that IP&G license, right? So the Information Protection Governance license. But for basic DLP is included in E3, right? You can do that today. With E3, you can start putting DLP policies in play today. It's specifically the locations that you are targeting, though, is going to be SharePoint and Exchange. When you look at a DLP policy makeup, you've got other things that are in there, such as Fabric, and you've got endpoints and Teams and all of those. That's not included in E3, right?
Okay.
That's the upgraded license capability.
So if we just want to do auto labeling and manage the labeling going forward in the Microsoft environment, but let Netscope do all the Spark stuff, what's the minimum license to have that label management and auto labeling available to us?
Auto labeling is not included in E3. Manual labeling is. So we can create our policies today with E3, and we can publish those to the user community. They can then manually label every new piece of content, right? So we force the labeling. We basically enforce it. The second a user opens a document, they will not be able to close it until they've given it a label, right?
Okay.
We can do that. That often is the right place to start before you start auto labeling. And part of the reason for that is hopefully the user creating the data knows what the sensitivity of that data is. If that makes sense. When we start auto labeling, we need to be very clear on what data, because remember at that point we're asking machine learning to determine what the data classification is or what it should be. That's a different proposition, right? Because different organizations that work with different data may treat that same data very differently. So just be aware. But if you're going to auto label, so trainable classifiers, that kind of stuff, the information protection governance uplift, I would question why you would do that uplift and not the full compliance suite, because
that's what I'm
we're obviously concerned about insider risk, communication, compliance, other things that you get with it. But again, minimum requirement for auto labeling will be the protection governance license.
I didn't know that you could enforce someone to give it a label before they close the document, so that might be the answer.
It's called mandatory labeling, right? So it's just forcing a user to select a label.
Yeah, no, cool. All right. Just while I'm talking to you, sorry guys, just one more question. Are you able to make this available in a recording to us after the meeting?
Absolutely fine. Yes, the recording will be going out to everybody, right?
Okay,
so
sweet.
Once it's done all its work, and it'll be available to everyone.
Okay, thanks ever so much. Much appreciated for your time.
No problem at all. I think we're just about on or over time by about 2 minutes. So I don't see any other questions. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Hope there was some useful information in there.